happy that Lena, who has written a beautiful review about it, is willing to give us a short summary. So for those of you who have not read it, you will get a little glimpse before we dive into some of the questions around the book. So for anyone, please, raise your hand if you want to say something, if you have a question, or if you want to speak up and join a discussion. It's free flow. I hope you have a coffee or a cup of tea or something next to you. So this is an informal chat, and please join. So Lena, I'm letting you introduce the book.
Thanks, Petra. I'm glad we're discussing this book because I loved it. So I hope everyone loved it too and read it or not. But yeah, I'm not going to sort of summarize the book. I'm just kind of going to highlight my main thoughts on the book. So I think what this book really emphasized for me was the long journey that we've had with TB, kind of going hand in hand with TB. From like 19th century TB deaths influencing our beliefs in vampires to even influencing women's fashion when they had to shorten their skirts to not drag in TB germs or whatever from the sidewalks. So I think the way that Vidya puts this in perspective in terms of our timeline, like with our struggle with TB, this really, for me, kind of puts into context the fact that it's been such a long time, and compared to, for example, our, against the backdrop of the incredibly quick progress against COVID, not that the response has been perfect, obviously, but at least the development of COVID-19 tools has been, really, really incredibly quick. And this kind of begs the question, we've had such a long journey with TB and kind of are lacking the same sort of, I guess, enthusiasm to finally eliminate TB, which really makes us think about, if we have the tools and the knowledge to address TB, but aren't, as a society, aren't really bothered to implement that knowledge or to make those tools accessible, then what hope do we have for actually eliminating TB? And kind of what's missing from our TB response. And so, as Vidya says, we seem to be recreating the same sort of patterns of neglect as she describes with when she kind of describes the way that governments put in place poorly designed public housing that put people at risk for infectious diseases. And then also fail people again when people do fall sick, and then have to navigate a maze of fragmented healthcare systems, and also get caught up in court waiting for life-saving drugs that remain inaccessible. So, so this all sounds bad, but also there is hope. So we know how to end TB, right? At this point, it's more of a political struggle rather than a scientific struggle. And so what's missing to get it done? And I think Vidya really encapsulates this when she says, while the pathogen evolves quickly, we remain prisoners to our biases. And that's been the case for such a long time, for an entire kind of timeline of struggle with TB. And so, she says we remain prisoners to our biases of race, caste, and class. And I think that really hits the nail on the head of, we can't eliminate a disease that's so closely linked to the social determinants of health if we don't address our biases. So on that note, I'm just going to open it up for other people's discussions. I think we had specific questions, so I'll leave that back to you, Petra.
Yeah, no, first of all, can I see a show of hands? Who has had a chance to read the book? You can just raise your hand or say something in the chat. Oh, great. Olivia, Sanchuk, Sonal, Robin, Lena. Okay, Ekta, great. So we have a lot of people who have read the book. So that's fantastic. So I would love to hear from everyone on what your ideas are, your main takeaways, and the way we thought that this might work the best. We have put a few key questions on the table, and then we have an open space. So why don't we do a few of the key questions first to get us around some of the main themes, and maybe Robin, if you can moderate us through the first question and read it out loud and take us, see if we get any input on that specific topic. Go ahead, take over the floor for me.
All right. Thanks, Petra, for bringing us all together. It was Petra posting on Twitter and sending me WhatsApp photos of her reading the book and underlining and highlighting key quotes that really spoke to her that made me immediately go and buy a copy. So I am probably like three quarters done the book, not quite finished, but almost there. And I'm really looking forward to your question, Petra, because there's so many stories within this one book that really spoke to me. Our first question for discussion, though, which I'm going to put in the chat box as well, is what are the key points and how does the book describe the TB burden? What are relevant for today's response to TB and other diseases like COVID-19, potentially? And I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Robin Waite. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Results Canada, which has been a longtime advocate in ending tuberculosis abroad. We at Results Canada are also the informal hosts of Stop TB Canada, which has a mission and a mandate of ending TB both at home and abroad. And I have the pleasure of working with a number of people on this call across a diversity of those different work streams to end TB. We're all about advocacy. Lena mentioned earlier that it's a political struggle. So really building the political will to end TB is what we need to lean into to really make it happen. So again, I'm throwing question in the chat box now, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on what key points in the book describe the TB burden.
Robin, why don't you give it a first go on that answer?
Okay, so I think the big thing that we saw, I mean, at least what spoke to me really clearly was when Vidya was describing the housing project in India, where essentially the affordable housing units that were built really close together, really tall high rises, with dense populations living closely together side by side in situations of poverty. Those two indicators were clear directions of links to a higher TB burden. So that's population density and generally poverty. I did think it was interesting and I didn't totally understand it. So if somebody else did, please explain it to me. But there was higher rates of TB at different levels within the high-rise building. And I think it was closer to the ground where there were higher rates of TB being found than in other spaces within that high-rise building, which I thought was quite interesting. Can anybody explain that or speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so you know what she meant, I think, by that is that in the lower floors, because the buildings are so close, there is very little sunlight, and sunlight is a huge enemy of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So these people are living essentially in perpetual darkness, more or less. She even showed how, you know, there were people that were kind of, they were rooming, they would work at night and they would sleep in the day. And because there was so little light, you know, it wasn't even a real issue for them. It was just kind of night all the time. And then because they were close to the street, they would, or they were on the lower floor, they would keep their windows closed all the time as well, partly to keep out, I guess, the pollution as well as the stuff that people may throw from the upper floor, since the whole system had very poor sanitation collection system. So so they're worse off being on the lower floor and then on the upper floors. Yeah. Say,
Okay. Oh, I see. Punitswar, you want to come in? You unmuted. Thanks for that explanation, Sonal. So far, sounds like population density, poverty, ventilation, so not keeping the windows open, access to daylight and sunlight, all things that should be in urban planning policy, and they are, but they're not implemented in many places around the world, including in London, which when I was living there, I had direct experience with access to natural sunlight being not prioritized in the building planning, which is really unfortunate. Kate, do you have anything to add to the question of key points about TB burden that you read into the book from?
Well, one thing that I just thought was kind of interesting just about the part that you're mentioning is that it just seems like, that made me think of COVID, is just that it just kind of seemed like the policy was based on getting people back to work, not necessarily keeping people healthy, and specifically a certain group of people back to work, the people that kind of keep a system running, you know what I mean? Not necessarily the people that are benefiting the most from their own work, you know what I mean? So that made me think a lot of just at least the United States, just kind of like the focus on getting people back to work, maybe more important than their lives or anyone else's, you know?
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of TB burden, people who are working in like frontline services, more at risk. We totally saw that with COVID-19. Like my sister is a dental hygienist, and she's working in people's mouths, which is a very high risk job for COVID-19 and TB. She went to work every day. I call myself a desker now, which I think is worse than, or just as bad as being a smoker. It's not a good way to be as a desker. I'm a desker now, but I wasn't as high risk because I could work from home. And we saw that play out with COVID-19 here in Canada. It was people working at Amazon warehouses and out on the front lines working at grocery stores who were
like meat packing was big in the United States, at least. Like, you know, they just came out with something about how the meat industry kind of like inflated, you know, the risks of us having meat shortages because they wanted people working. We were still able to export meat in the United States. Like, so, you know, there clearly wasn't ever a shortage. You know, people got to work.
Yeah. Okay, Petra, do you think we're good on that question? Or, oh, Lena, you have more?
Yeah, I was just gonna add that I also found it interesting that I forget the specific passage in the book, but it was like talking about how also kind of the link with colonialism, where these kind of settlements were established of workers that were basically, they wanted to keep them close, but not have them like directly in their backyards, so that these people could like provide the services that they wanted and work in like horrible conditions and also live in horrible conditions, because they wanted them to be close to like the settlements of, where I guess upper class people were living, so that they could, so that they could be close to kind of provide the services that people wanted, but not kind of prioritizing their living conditions at all. And this created just like these settlements on, like outside of kind of the main settlements that were just that had a really, really high rate of TB as well. So just kind of the idea that and it just feels like we did this again with COVID, just like deprioritizing frontline workers so that the rest of us could kind of be comfortable in our little safe spaces, right? So it just, when I read that passage, I was like, oh my God, it's like we haven't learned anything. And yeah, so I think that also connects to the burden as well, because you see how you can have a very different burden in a very geographically similar place. Yeah.
I found that crazy that it was a draw. It was like a perk of working there. It's like accommodation is part of your like work package, but it's unsafe accommodation. So very different. But then once you're in that role with accommodation, you're kind of even locked into that job, because if you leave that job, you also then lose your accommodation, which from a policy perspective is potentially pretty dangerous. Petra, should I hand it over to you for question number 2?
Sure. Then? So thanks. I mean, I think these were excellent points, linking how she described and used the TB burden as an example, also how today's struggles with COVID really hasn't that much changed in terms of our economic power really driving the world, and not so much the value of people. I'm just wanting to see if there's anyone in the room who wants to jump in on this particular topic before we move to the next question. And the next question I've put in the chat, the next question is, what are some of the key calls to action related to strengthening NTB efforts? But this last question was really like, how has the TB burden been portrayed in the book and is kind of connected to COVID or any other health issues that we're seeing today? Anyone who wants to jump in on that particular topic? Feel free to raise your hand or just take the floor. If not, then we're moving on to the next point. So I would love to hear what people feel are some of the key calls to action. There are some very concrete and specific suggestions in the book on what needs to change, and would love to hear if people have specific thoughts about that before I call on some people for some of the points. Anyone who wants to kind of volunteer and jump in? And otherwise, I'm going to ask Kate to talk a little bit about patient advocacy. I know you've not fully finished the book, but she has many excellent examples and a lot of stories in there. So please, Kate, take on some of these points, and maybe if you would be willing to speak to some of that.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that when we talk about, patient advocacy, it's important to talk to people that have had TB, like me, but and we're all over the world, about their experiences, to really listen to them, to really give them a space where they feel like they can talk about their care openly and freely, and maybe be critical of parts of it. And I really do think that there should be more of a space, just in when we're listening to people who have had TB in general, there's a lot of places where I feel like we're starting to see more advocacy there, but I still think too much stuff is kind of done in like English only. I do think, it's the only language I speak. So, just full disclosure, but, we do see just a lot of the opportunities are English only. I do see a lot of places for advocacy spaces that still kind of require, people in the community to maybe have a resume or have like letters of recommendation, or just like a lot of just barriers to entry kind of. That I'd like to see kind of moved. I'd love to see just more advocacy opportunities for people, where either there's translation or maybe, just things happening in other languages that then get and points get translated, or just more opportunities and less barriers to entry. And then the hard part is like making sure that the thoughts that people have are actually really implemented and used, So those were the, that's kind of like my real thought right now when we're talking about the advocacy that former patients or affected community, have.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And I think she describes in the book Nandita's story and really goes into a lot of detail about the access to bedequalin and the issues related to access to drugs in general, and improving better drugs, and that everyone has access to drugs. And what I really love about the book is that she's not hesitant to call the things as they are. It's just, she's really describing it with full-on compassion. And I'm just looking at page 234, where she talks about the anger about bedequalin, and talking about the moral failure and the anger around for doctors not diagnosing properly, the anger for the private sector system not getting access to the pharmaceutical areas, having patents. So she's really describing many of these components that impact patients on an immediate level. So but before I keep on ranting, I want to open the floor. Is there anyone else who wants to talk about this particular patient advocacy topic, or more general key calls to action? What did you read in the book?
I have something to add, if that's okay.
Yeah, please go ahead, Olivia.
I think Kate touched on like a really interesting point about patient advocacy, and also like having a space where we can be critical of the care that patients have received. I think that's something that's definitely not talked about enough. And often, like when patients are critical, like totally understand if someone's critical about something I'm doing, I'm going to be very like against it and be like, no, like this is the right way. But I think that's something that's definitely missing, not just in TB care, but in healthcare in general, just for patients to say like, this is the care I received. And I think X, Y, and Z were done wrong, and these are ways in which we can improve them, and then like how to actually like take those critiques and implement them into the system.
Great point, and very practical too. And I mean, yeah, I completely agree. Anyone else?
I mean, she also, advocates for improving the whole housing situation, which will just the environment in which people live, that would then reduce the risk of, being exposed to TB. Not even the whole, the whole aspect of the improving nutrition and all that is, another aspect of this as well. I mean, a lot of the people are just, undernourished, and that's been well known to be a major risk factor for developing, TB disease and not getting better, even with treatment as much as someone who's better nourished. So there's a whole social upheaval that's necessary to improve the life of people. It's a very TB. I mean, TB is a social disease in the sense that it reflects the incidence is reflected by the level of living of the living status of people. The poverty status. So.
Yeah, great point. Robin?
Yeah, I think that the example from India like really spoke to me on that too. And I was like, every single urban planning policy and housing policy document everywhere in the world needs to reflect learning those lessons, and then not just be there, but actually be enforced in the implementation of how things are built, because that doesn't seem to happen. There's a disconnect between what's in policy and then what's happening in practice. On the working with and amplifying the voices of people with experience having tuberculosis, a couple of really critical things on that point is, at Results Canada anyways, we're always making sure we compensate people for their really valuable time. They're giving their time outside of their daily jobs, and it shouldn't be free work. We should be paying them to be participating. So Results Canada always does that, and part of our role is telling other organizations that they should be doing the same thing and slightly shaming them if they're not. So that's that. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of calls to action and see what other people thought about this, but public awareness raising campaigns. I thought it was really interesting looking at the example of the public awareness raising and behavior change campaigns in the US with spitting, and they didn't work very well. It wasn't working. I don't think I totally understood, okay, like why didn't it work? What could have, should have worked better? What did we learn from that example in terms of changing behavior to protect people from respiratory infectious diseases like TB and COVID-19? So I'd be curious to hear from others as to what you might have picked up from that in terms of learning lessons from that experience. Because I think that's another strong call to action, is we have more work to do there.
Anyone want to jump in on the health education campaigns? I'd actually written down, Robin, one of the slogans was "spitting positively forbidden" as one of the slogans in that time. And I thought, when I was reflecting on it, it's like, that's exactly, you tell people a certain behavior on how to act or not, but you can't really forbid it, but you're kind of positively forbidding it. And the confusion around that, yeah, it shows with the masking mandates that were and the kind of push and pull of support and not support around the whole freedom movement these days. I think there's so many parallels. If there is restrictions from government for a public health purpose, there's a lot of uprising of people feeling that their freedom is being impacted, or their behaviors are being restricted. So I don't have a complete answer to your question, but I think there's lots to learn and lots that we can reflect on and what we see around us today as well. Does anyone else want to jump in here?
I think it was also interesting. I don't think this was like the main focus, but I think it was also interesting how the spitting policy was kind of, directed at men, and then
Yeah,
that didn't
yeah.
work out. And then the skirts was like directed at, they're like, well, okay, it's so now we'll just do something that impacts women. And yeah, I found that interesting as well. And yeah, it wasn't entirely clear to me why the spitting thing didn't work out. I think it was just it just wasn't really, it was like it was there, but it wasn't it wasn't enforced. Which is like, why are we not enforcing it if then we're gonna police like women's attire? I don't know. So yeah, I found that really interesting, although that I don't think was the main focus, but yeah, it was interesting gender differences.
Kate and Robin, I think you both want to talk about that.
Oh no,
Go ahead.
I totally agree. Like that's what I was thinking of as soon as Robin brought it up. I was thinking it was interesting to see that, and it was also interesting to see that, basically like, especially back then, like the power dynamic between men and women, like when you tried to implement a change for the people in power, like, or like how unsuccessful you were, but the people that kind of weren't, like then we'll just deviate to that, you know what I mean, like we'll just and it just how quickly, and okay, well, we're not gonna, these guys aren't doing what we're doing, so we'll just put all the change behavior, all the blame, everything on these guys, and I know I am a woman, but I just think that you could see parallels to that, and even in the COVID response, just kind of like, well, if we can't get this one group that tends to be the group that gets to make the most decisions or benefit from decisions to change their behavior, we'll put all the burden and all the blame and everything on those people.
Yeah. Robin, did you want to talk about that?
I'll just say I remember what worked from reading the book. It was as soon as they introduced spittoons, so they allowed the behavior to continue, but they decreased the risk of it by giving the spittoons and like the pocket carry spittoons and the spittoons in the corner of like every space that existed. And then men started spitting in those. And it also kind of became like trendy to carry a spittoon. Yeah, so kind of a harm reduction approach. So anyways, I just remembered that was what worked. But I see Zuina coming in.
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
Sorry, I was watching through the YouTube because I've not finished the book, but I found the discussion very interesting. And taking into consideration that I am from where TB is still high burden, the developing country, I thought it could be good to share what I had experienced with the book, with what we are experiencing in our country. It's like when I read about Mumbai, I was picturing our city, Dar es Salaam city, and all those situations, the immigration and all those, and then learning about how the disease started in the developed world, and they did some things, and the disease was controlled. And as you have said, TB, with this book, we have seen TB is a social disease. And what they did in the developed country is improving people's lives. So that should definitely work in our country's setup. I don't know why our governments, they're not committing to this, but this is so obvious. It worked because of improving people's lives. And if you look at the story of the Mumbai, you could see even the story in New York and all those cities. So I thought I could share this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Savannah. Yes, and I think you beautifully lead us into the next question, which I'm going to put in the chat right now. And the next question, Lena, do you want to take the next question? Because you've written about this in your book. And Savannah, jump back in when we talk about this topic as well. I'd love to hear from everyone. Go ahead.
Sure.
Lena.
Yeah, so I think, as I kind of brought up in my intro, I think the quote that really stuck with me from this book was like was the one about systemic changes, like the fact that the pathogen evolves, but we have not evolved in terms of our way of thinking about our own biases, and that's really the biggest systemic hurdle to get over to finally address TB. So, and I think it's really well described in the book, especially with like Mumbai, where she talks about like the inequality in Mumbai of like the huge fancy skyscrapers, and then at the bottom you have like the people living in informal settlements and things like that, and that's just like a direct correlative transmission risk. And so so I think, yeah, it's really for me, it's really like I've said, it's a political struggle rather than a scientific. I mean, obviously it's also still a scientific struggle, but it's becoming more and more a political struggle in the similar way that we've seen with COVID. And really, like, these sort of social systemic changes are at the core of this. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in with what they thought, or a quote that kind of highlighted this, or a passage in the book. I think it's also not just like, you know, it's not just important to think about what are the systemic changes that we need to see, but also kind of what are our, like, why do we have such hesitation with implementing systemic changes? Or yeah, and like, how do we get over those? Because even with COVID, we see that like we know that vaccine equity is going to solve the problem, right? And it's not even just a question of like of, you know, sharing, but I mean, obviously it is, but it's also like, we know that it's not just, you know, ethically and biologically and scientifically rational to do this, but also economically. So it's like, if we can't even get those people on our side when we make the economic argument, then like, how are we gonna do it, right? So it's kind of just this reluctance to implement systemic changes, even when they're obviously beneficial, not just to, you know, specific groups, but literally to everyone. Then this is kind of like, while reading this, I was just like, oh my goodness, it's, yeah. So if we can't do it for COVID, then can we do it for TB? Like, how will it be different? Is just a question that I was also asking myself. It's not just the systemic changes themselves that are required, but how do we actually get there when we're so reluctant to implement them?
Go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, so a couple of systemic level changes that are relevant here would be, and it comes from the book based on the Vidaculin example, but also yesterday, well, the COVID-19 example too. And yesterday was the second global COVID summit. And I think the president of Indonesia had some of the most powerful words related to systemic change that needs to happen. And he said very point blank that monopolies, for-profit monopolies, should not exist within the health industry sector. So we need to shift away from this for-profit corporate model of like testing, treatment, vaccine, tool development, and selling. I don't know how we do that, but that really needs to become, those need to become public goods, and we need to have ownership over them as people. And then the other thing, and I have no idea how to get there, I define myself first and foremost as a global citizen who gives a shit, because I really believe that the only thing still confined by borders is the free movement of people and people's political power. So our government systems are just inherently not fit for purpose right now. And I talk to so many parliamentarians in Canada, and they tell me that, oh, well, my constituents don't talk about global issues, so I'm not gonna like care about global stuff. I'm like, well, dude, is your constituent worried about COVID-19? Are they worried about climate crisis? Are they pissed off that the cost of food and gas is increasing? Yes, yes, yes. Those are global issues, regardless of them telling you their geographically defined experience. The solution is a domestic and a global one. So somehow getting that shift of thinking within the public, and also our politicians who are making decisions so that they see themselves as global citizens first, is a critical systematic change that needs to happen as well.
Great words, Robin. Anyone else wants to jump in on this?
I do just want to back you up that like the way that you see some changes really just to take the money out of it. Like, you know what I mean? Like when it's like, even if it's best for most people, if it makes sense for most people, if it this for most people, it doesn't truly matter if a few people are, you know what I mean, benefiting way more than everybody else. Like, and those are the people that are kind of in the driver's seat, you know. We just see that again and again. So I mean, I just want to say that I completely agree.
I see that Rabia is posting in the chat and asking, what key actions does the book summarize towards addressing TB, COVID, and the non-communicable diseases? So anyone want to take that question? I think if I can jump in, linking it back to the systemic change, the book really clearly calls out for a global picture of solution, and it really talks about the human value, and at the core it has compassion with people. And what it's really portraying very well is that we've created governance systems and financial systems and economic markets and profit driven models that make the world tick, and they stand juxtaposed to the human value at the core. And I think that is a huge systemic issue, which then trickles down in so many layers of it, right? It talks about racism, and it talks about colonialism. It talks about many of these old concepts that have been with us for centuries. And basically the book, Rabia, is asking us to topple the whole system for a proper addressing human value at the core. And I think that's only that small little task that's on our plate. And I think as part of ending TB, we're contributing to that, if in our mind is also contributing to changing a system that works better for people. So that would be my response in sort of how I see it, and some of the core things I really took. One of the key quotes in her book that I really valued is, if poverty is the disease, TB is the symptom. And that links it really to the economic issue. And the other thing that I thought she did so well in her closing of the book, she really shows that wealth is health. Wealth is not profit. And as long as we keep focusing on wealth is profit in the world, we will lose out. Everyone will lose out. So those are some of the things in terms of a short answer to you, Rabia, but anyone else, if you want to jump in and have some points that you think contribute to how can we change the world for better, because now we're really taking on the whole world, right? Lena.
Yeah, thank you, Petra. I'm just adding to what we have been talking about. I just want to think out loud, like why our governments are not focusing on TB. You know, for me, I'm new in TB world. I just graduated medical school in 2003, and TB was still there, and HIV was coming at that time. You know, and the way HIV was tackled is totally different from how TB is being tackled. And still, TB is the #1 killer for people living with HIV. So we saw now, we have seen with this book that TB is a social disease, and the multi-sectoral approach would be the proper way. And it is not it's not a breaking news, you know. So I'm thinking maybe the government have been shown like how much are they losing for not addressing TB, you know, because we are blind, thinking that it does not have an economic impact to our government, which is not true. You know, I remember my uncle, when I was so young, my uncle fell sick with TB, and he was taking injections, and it was a big deal in the family. Like, our uncle has TB. It was like that scary thing, you know. Now thinking from all that time until today, we are still singing on that thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuena. I'm just wondering, Rabia, Zuena is in the same country. You're both in Tanzania. what do you think? I mean, when you asked the question in the chat, but do you want to speak to some of these things in terms of how you see that it's being dealt with in Tanzania?
Well, maybe I'll just chip in before Rabia, like a continuation of what I've just said. So I think in our country or in many other African countries, we are being driven by what developed countries want. Like the way I said about how we tackled HIV and then left TB. You know, it was that drive, that push from outside. We have this grant for HIV. You know, we don't have it for TB. So what can we do then? You know, so somehow that is a fact as well. From people who have money, you know, how do they influence these countries which do not have? We are really driven by that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Suwena. Rabia, do you want to step in here? I'm giving Rabia a minute to see if she can unmute herself, and in the meantime, maybe Olivia.
Yeah, I think Robin really hit the nail on the head when she said take the money out of healthcare. Like, we shouldn't have like pharmaceutical companies and like philanthropists and all these people just like driving what we do and how we act. It should be, there's a problem, let's fix it, and let's do what we can to fix it. And like, I know that's like a very like black and white kind of statement, like, oh, it's so simple, but like, I feel like that's how it should be. Like, it shouldn't be like who's funding what, and that's where we're going with it.
Great point, Olivia. I'm seeing that Robin has her hand raised, so I'm just want to, Robin, go ahead, pick it up from here.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that, Olivia, and say, you know, the problem is because people's political power has been constrained to borders, but for-profit corporations' power certainly is not constrained to borders. They are way more powerful within our democratic systems right now. Like, they literally have more influence on decision makers than people do. So we're not going to be able to take the money out of healthcare until that changes. I don't know how to make that change, but just to be honest, that is what's happening. That's part of the problem, is the power of the for-profit corporate monopolies in the world. Our democracy is letting them influence. So here in Canada, our prime minister has been hesitant to sign on to the TRIPS waiver that was tabled by India and South Africa, so that there's limited IP risk and liability for countries who need to develop COVID-19 tools, because we didn't have the domestic capacity to develop our own vaccines here in Canada. And we wanted to make a deal with a pharmaceutical company that would bring that capacity to Canada. And if we said to those pharmas that we were going to sign on to TRIPS, that would make them mad and risk the opportunity for us to bring the capacity domestically here. So like, that's just an example of them having a ton of power over our politicians, and how to change it, I'm not super sure, but I will tell you that around the world, government's legitimacy and trust in governments are at an absolute all-time low. So low everywhere. Look at the Edelman Trust Barometer. It gets launched every year at Davos. It's like catastrophic. And if I was a person that was in a political position, I'd be scared. I'd be like, oh my goodness, there's no trust in me anymore from the people. When is this going to come to a tipping point in a head? So I don't know, but I just want to throw it out there that that's the reality. And that means that it's critical that the likes of you and I engage in the political process, even though it's a frustrating cesspool sometimes. If we don't engage, then this power imbalance is just going to keep getting like less and less in our favor. So yeah, just wanted to kind of flag that and articulate that perspective too, because that's at the heart of why we are seeing money in the health system.
No, 100%.
Okay, good, Olivia. Anyone, did you want to say more, Olivia?
Sorry, I could not find the mute button. No, but I definitely, like, I 100% agree. I know it's not like a simple fix, but just like speaking out and trying to get it's just like a drive for change kind of, I think, is the way we got to go forth about it.
I agree. And I think what's maybe frustrating, the way I look at it, is also that we're in a perpetual circle. Like, companies benefit from a weak government because then there will be no regulation. And at the same time, we need regulation to kind of put companies more in their place and regulate, whether we're talking about pharmaceutical and TRIPS, or whether we're talking about the information technology needs to be regulated for the health and the value of the human to be protected. And but a weaker government is more beneficial for companies. And sadly, we're in that loop where one is trying to weaken the other for their own benefit. So yeah, that's maybe what does that say for us as a call to action? As a global citizen who gives a shit, I think we supporting global treaties or regulatory mechanisms that really protect people is something that we all need to step into. And if we can influence through shareholders, or if we can influence companies to actually adhere to regulations and to change regulations, not for profit, but for people, we might also have more of a positive influence. And I think you're right, Robin. It is about the citizenship speaking up, and for us to really rally together as voices, so that our voices are stronger. And that's bringing it back to the book. She's really talking about unifying patients' voices and supporting voices for particularly that reason. So now that I've brought it back to the book, I want to kind of open it up to anyone who wants to take the floor. I'm seeing, I know that Rabia is in the bus, so can't really speak. But Raquel, if you want to say something, Sonal, if you want to reflect on any other point of the book that spoke to you that we haven't talked about yet, I just want to use the last 10 minutes for anyone to share whatever they thought about the topic Phantom Plague or about the book in general. Please feel free to take the floor.
I think I'd have to read it again to get a better sense of why the title is, what it is. Maybe others have thoughts on it. It's a because we know there is just so much TB. There is, a lot of it is undiagnosed. Is that what she's referring to in the Phantom Plague? Maybe I read it a little too fast and didn't quite digest all the things. But one thing I do want to point out, I'm a physician, I'm a TB clinician. And so one of the things that I think I picked up and sort of concerned me a little bit is, she describes the odyssey of some of these individuals in search of these new expensive drugs that are extremely, difficult to come by. And the way she presented is like, okay, that one drug is going to cure them. And, and that's a very, that's a misleading message, because, TB has to be treated with multiple drugs, because otherwise you create more resistance. And so I think, it would have been good, I think, if she presented that, this is just one drug in that whole regimen that they needed. But anyway. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that's, and there's a lot more to say, I think, about all the drug resistance and about the drug piece in this book is really important. And thank you for bringing that up. This morning, I flipped through the book again, and I did find the quote on how it's linked to the Phantom Plague. So I'm trying to find it. But in the meantime,
I have a response to that. So
you did.
The way I interpret it, I might be wrong, but the way I interpret it, which I actually found really interesting. I was going to bring the discussion back to the title anyway, so good that we're there, because so my interpretation was that it's such a, like, it's so invisible to policymakers despite having such a huge burden. So that was my interpretation of why she was calling it a Phantom Plague, because it's like, I think specifically she says we've like socially constructed a phantom plague. So it's kind of like we've put in place the social conditions that lead to vulnerability to this disease, but then we are not addressing it with the same, with like we're not committing resources in the like to the same extent, like proportionate to the burden, I think. So that's kind of why she's calling it a phantom plague, in terms of it being, yes, as Lena says, neglected / invisible. Yeah. So I think that was my interpretation of it. And this really kind of I think COVID hits this home as well, because like, for example, we like everyone calls COVID a pandemic, but then like we don't really call it to be a pandemic, but it is a pandemic, right? And it's a current pandemic, like technically, you know. So it's also just about the language we use to describe it, which kind of makes it more, yeah, neglected, more invisible, kind of on the sidelines. And then COVID cropped up and everyone was like, oh my God, you know, like, but nobody knew. I mean, obviously COVID is, you know, it continues, and now has killed more people than like altogether. But if we consider TB like annually, and the fact that it's been killing this many people for so many years, right? And just the fact that like prior to COVID, nobody knew what the biggest infectious disease killer really was. I mean, nobody outside of the TB world really knew like that it was TB. So kind of, I think this is kind of the invisible part, or the phantom part that she was getting at when she describes it as phantom. Yeah.
Great points. Great points. I'm being quiet before I go into Robin's question that is in the chat. Is there anyone who wants to jump in on the title, Phantom Plague? I saw some good points. I think you've covered it, Lena, and with the points in the chat from neglected and invisible, that's great. So Robin is saying, how do people feel about WHO calling it that? Why don't you say it, Robin? Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I've always just reflected on the World Health Organization explicitly saying that TB is a disease of poverty, and in my reflection on it, I've wondered if that in and of itself is actually damaging and contributing and neglect and downplaying, you know, TB and stigmatizing and all that. I just wonder if anybody else kind of felt the same or had thoughts on that.
Okay.
Well, I tend to say like it's a disease of inequity, or that it's a disease of, you know, I like to say like, you know, TB can be found at any point where, you know, there's any kind of inequity. And so I know that might seem kind of like the same thing, but it's not. Like if you constantly link it just to poverty, it's almost kind of like, it feels to me like a cop out, because it feels like, you know, there will always be, you know, people who have less and more. No one, you know, I mean, like, you know, it's not necessarily, we can eliminate TB, like, you know what I mean? And we can also eliminate poverty, don't get me wrong, but like it just feels almost like if you attach it that way, it makes it seem, I'm not articulating this well, but like almost inevitable, or almost, you know, like you can't deal with it. But we can eliminate TB. We have all the tools. We just don't have, you know, enough of the funding and the political will. But this is a disease that's currently curable. It's rapidly becoming resistant and incurable as we sit here, but we do have the tools we need. You know, it's just scaling up those tools and making those tools more accessible, you know. So it's really more just like we're choosing not to do it, you know. And even if everyone on this call is not, I mean, I just say as a society we're choosing not to do it. It's very, we're able to do this, you know. So I don't know if I'm articulating quite your question wrong, but that's why I usually tend to just kind of keep saying, you know, inequity, because even in places where we have more money, like a country like the United States, like, you know, you're more at risk if you're in a situation, you know what I mean, where even if you're in a more urban area, even if you're wealthy, you're at higher risk. You know what I mean? Like they're not necessarily tied together. You know, it's just so that's it. I should think more about my answer, but I got fired up when I saw that.
I think that's a really good point. And I also, and kind of along the same lines of like avoiding the cop out or avoiding kind of saying like, oh, it's, you know, yeah, I really liked Vidya's definition of calling it like a socially constructed disease, because it means that we have constructed it, like we have created the conditions that lead to like higher risk of transmission or whatever, and therefore it's our responsibility to also reverse those effects. So I think socially like I really like the word constructed in there, because it means that we've had like an active role in creating the inequalities that lead to this, and therefore we have to have a role to in reversing them. So I like socially constructed disease. Maybe we should suggest that to the WHO.
I think language is really important, and I think we've learned so much during this COVID pandemic that definitely around, I love the idea of calling it a disease of inequity and a constructed disease, definitely. And the constructed problem is for sure building on the history, what we have in a whole social long story. And I'm just commenting on, I see that Rabia posted in about Tanzania, basically saying the same thing, that we do have the tools, but we really need the advocacy from civil societies to work to really get the funding and the fight to the TB problem up to the level that it deserves the attention. And that's part of what I would argue in terms of our smaller world. I mean, we can't fix the whole world, even though it's all linked to the systems and all the massive changes. We can make changes within our TB world. And yes, we do have the tools, but maybe we need a new innovative spittoon to kind of make it easier, make it even more easy for us, like a shorter drug, rapid test that when you go to the pharmacy, you can immediately know whether you have TB or not. There are improvements that we need to make for us to, within the TB world, to have a better fight that we can actually win. I'm seeing some more things in the chat that I'm not reading while I'm talking, but I'm giving everyone a chance, one last chance. I know we have 1 minute left officially, but please, who wants to do the closing word? Anyone who wants to pick up the floor and close us off?
I will say that, like, I read a lot of books about TB, and I really think that this book is great because it is clearly written by a journalist. Like, it's engaging, it moves quickly. I feel like I don't feel like it's dumbed down at all, but I feel like I could follow it. I feel like it's a good book for it's now going to be like the go-to one that I hand to other people, because I just feel like a lot of times, like, I'll read things about TB, and again, like, language, it's just like, I feel like I'm I'm a layperson, and when I read these things, I feel like wish there was a lay abstract for this book for me to read. You know what I mean? Like, I'm always looking for the lay thing, but like and I just feel like this book was like very easy to read and gave me a lot of information very, very quickly. So I'm very grateful for it.
Beautiful, beautiful summary. Wonderful. And yes, another book that I'm seeing in the chat, Lena is saying another great book is Stigmatized. I will pick it up from Honda. I'll pick it up from my shelf here. If anyone wants to find this book, that's also a great book to read, and very much inspiring, with messages of hope on how we can end TB in the world. So maybe with that, I want to just send loves and hearts to everyone around the world. And Party Science, thank you so much for joining us on a Friday chat with coffee and water and tea. Really enjoyed talking with everyone about the book, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. Please reach out if you have any ideas on what we could talk about in another coffee chat. Would love to put something on together with anyone from the community. So thank you, everyone. Wonderful to see you and talk with you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.